Imagine a world before cities, before roads, before the gentle hum of electricity. A world where the loudest sound was the wind and the brightest light, the sun. Now, picture that primeval landscape, vast, untamed forests stretching further than any modern map could conceive, plains dense with forgotten grasses, and mountains still shedding the last vestiges of ancient ice. This was Earth, billions of years ago. And even then, before the first human whispered a single word, before the first tool was sharpened, there was fire. Not just a comforting glow of a hearth, but an apocalyptic, roaring beast born from the very heart of the planet. For millennia, the Earth brewed its own destruction. Volcanoes, spewing molten rock and superheated gases, were nature's own angry incandescent breath. Lightning, splitting ancient trees with surgical precision, ignited forests so vast they would burn for months, even years. These weren't isolated blazes. They were continent-spanning infernos, wiping clean entire ecosystems with a terrifying, undeniable efficiency. Imagine a world where the air itself shimmered with heat, where the sky was perpetually bruised with smoke, and the only soundtrack was the crackle and roar of an endless conflagration. Rivers boiled, ancient stones cracked under the intense heat, and the very ground seemed to sigh as it turned to ash. This was the dawn of destruction, a primeval force shaping the planet long before humanity ever arrived to witness its terrifying beauty. But fire, in its raw, untamed form, was more than just a destructive force. It was a sculptor, a cleanser, a brutal, relentless gardener. After the apocalyptic burn, after the smoke cleared and the rain finally fell, life would always return. New grasses would sprout, drawing nutrients from the ash. Dormant seeds, once buried deep, would crack open, awakened by the heat. Animals, driven from their homes, would eventually return to find a revitalized landscape, ripe for new growth. This was the Earth's ancient rhythm. Burn, die, renew. A cycle of creation and annihilation, playing out on a canvas so grand, it boggles the modern mind. And for millions of years, fire remained the ultimate chaotic force, a brutal, beautiful, utterly indifferent master of the world. Now, fast forward a few million years. You're an early hominid, perhaps huddling in a cave or foraging in a primal forest. Your world is one of constant vulnerability. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be a predator. Every shadow, a threat. Then one day, something changes. A distant column of smoke rises against the horizon. Maybe a lightning strike. Maybe a volcanic tremor. But this fire, it's different. It's not just a distant menace. It's a terrifying, mesmerizing presence. You've seen nature's raw power, but this is something else. The heat radiates. The air crackles with energy, and as the blaze approaches, fear gives way to a primal awe. This was humanity's first real encounter with the destructive majesty of the wildfire. It's hard to overstate the impact this primordial fire would have had on early humans. For a creature still learning to master its environment, dependent on fragile shelters and rudimentary tools, a widespread wildfire would have been nothing short of a divine apocalypse. Imagine the sheer terror of walls of flame sweeping across the landscape, forcing entire groups to flee, abandoning everything. The choking smoke, the suffocating heat, the blinding ash falling from the sky like a dark snow, the desperate scramble for safety, knowing that anything caught in its path would simply cease to exist. This was not a fire you could fight. It was a force you could only escape or be consumed by. It carved fear into the very DNA of our ancestors, a primal memory of incandescent terror. But then came the turning point, the accidental discovery. Perhaps a brave, desperate soul, driven by hunger or curiosity, ventured into the aftermath of a natural fire. They found burnt game, cooked meat, easier to digest, more nutritious. They learned that fire could clear land, drive away predators, keep them warm during brutal nights. They learned to control it. This wasn't immediate, of course. For thousands of years, the relationship remained tenuous, respectful, bore necessity. They would carefully nurture embers, carry them from camp to camp, a flickering lifeline against a vast, cold darkness. Fire became tool, weapon, protector, and community builder. It's hard to imagine the sheer revolutionary impact to control fire. It cooked food, Purified water, hardened tools, provided light, and most importantly, kept predators at bay. It allowed early humans to survive harsher climates, to expand their territories, to thrive where they once only barely clung to existence. It was arguably the single most important technological leap in early human history. But control, even then, was a delicate dance. You learned to master the small flame, but the raging inferno, that was still something else entirely. Early human settlements, often built from flammable materials like wood, thatch, and animal hides, were incredibly vulnerable. A stray spark, an unattended ember, a cooking fire gone wrong, and suddenly, your entire village, your only shelter, your carefully hoarded supplies, could be reduced to a pile of smoldering ash in minutes. Think of small, tightly packed communities, no fire brigades, no water hoses, no escape routes beyond simply running. The losses would have been absolute. Lives, food stores, tools, shelter, everything consumed by the fiery maw. Archaeological evidence from ancient settlements worldwide points to repeated, devastating fires. Sometimes, these were deliberate acts of warfare. Burning an enemy village was a brutal, effective tactic. But often, the evidence suggests accidental blazes, leaving behind layers of charred timbers, vitrified clay, and the silent, tragic remains of communities suddenly wiped from a map. It wasn't just a threat. It was a constant, ever-present reality. For early humans, the beauty and utility of fire came hand in hand with its terrifying, destructive potential. They learned to live with fire, in every sense of the word, constantly balancing its gifts against its insatiable hunger. Consider the immense, unknowable scale of these ancient conflagrations before human records began. Forests so old, so dense, that a single ignition could trigger a chain reaction spanning hundreds of miles. Peat bogs, smoldering underground for years, releasing colossal amounts of smoke and carbon. Volcanic eruptions, blanketing vast areas with superheated ash, igniting everything in their path. These events were not contained. They were ecological resets, reshaping entire continents. For early humans, witnessing such a blaze would have been a profoundly spiritual, terrifying experience. It wasn't just a natural disaster. It was the gods themselves raining down fire, remaking the world. And as millennia passed and humanity began to cluster into larger, more permanent settlements, that primordial destructive force would find new, even more vulnerable targets. But ancient history's relationship with flame was far from over. From the sprawling wilds to the very heart of human civilization, fire was about to unleash a new, terrifying kind of destruction, the urban inferno. Imagine this. You're not in a quiet forest watching ancient fires dance. You're in a Roman city, say, the teeming metropolis of Rome itself. And if those ancient brush fires were an accidental match strike in dry woods, Roman cities were a tinderbox crammed into a sardine can. Let's be clear, ancient urban centers, particularly imperial Rome, were catastrophic fire hazards just waiting for a spark. Picture it. Narrow, winding streets barely wide enough for a single cart, lined on both sides by towering, rickety apartment buildings. These instantly, some 5 or 6 stories high, were constructed from a horrifying mix of cheap timber, plaster, and sun-dried brick. Think less modern skyscraper, more vertical bonfire waiting for a strong breeze. These flimsy structures were packed shoulder to shoulder, often with no fire breaks between them. Your neighbor's kitchen wall might be your bedroom wall. In ancient Rome, kitchens meant open flames. Every home, from the humblest hovel to the grandest patrician villa, relied on fire for everything. Cooking, open hearth. Heating, charcoal brazier. Lighting after dark, oil lamps and candles. It was a constant, intimate dance with flame in a city built largely of kindling. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, cooking oil, and the underlying perfume of a city that didn't believe in plumbing. You were living in a giant, combustible jigsaw puzzle, and every crackle of a neighbor's hearth was a quiet whisper of impending doom. And then it happened, not for the first time, but certainly on the most infamous scale. July of 64 C, the Great Fire of Rome. The precise cause remains a fiery debate, fueled by history's greatest villain, Emperor Nero. Some say accidental, a spark from a shop or a stray ember from a brazier. Others whisper of Nero himself, wanting to clear space for his grandiose architectural visions, his infamous golden house, the Domus Aurea. He was, after all, a man with a penchant for spectacle and a distinct lack of empathy. Did he truly fiddle while Rome burned? Probably not literally, but the image stuck because, well, it felt true. The fire began in the Circus Maximus, a massive chariot racing stadium surrounded by shops and wooden tenements. Fueled by dry timber, summer winds, and the sheer density of the city, it erupted like a dragon's breath, consuming everything in its path. It wasn't just a fire. It was a firestorm, a living, roaring entity that carved a path of unimaginable destruction. For 6 long, agonizing days and 7 nights, Rome burned. Imagine the terror. The sky a permanent, choking red, ash raining down like black snow, the air thick with the smell of scorched wood, melting pitch, and something far worse, burning flesh. The roar of the flames drowned out the screams, the crackle and collapse of buildings, a constant, terrifying symphony of destruction. Thousands were trapped, either consumed by the inferno or crushed by collapsing structures. Whole districts vanished. Ancient temples, public buildings, and historical monuments, some dating back centuries, crumbled into dust. The Forum, the beating heart of the empire, was ravaged. The streets, already narrow, became death traps, clogged with debris and fleeing citizens. Those who escaped the flames faced hunger, exposure, and the despair of utter homelessness. They slept under the open, smoke-stained sky, surrounded by the smoldering ruins of their lives, clutching whatever meager possessions they had managed to salvage. What about fighting it? Well, Rome had its firefighters, the Vigiles Urbani, established by Augustus decades earlier. Think of them as a blend of night watchmen, police, and early fire department. They were equipped with buckets, axes, grappling hooks, and rudimentary pumps. But against the conflagration of the scale, they were utterly outmatched. Their tactics involved creating fire breaks, demolishing buildings ahead of the blaze to starve of fuel. It was a brutal, desperate measure, often too little, too late, and met with the desperate pleas of citizens watching their homes torn down. The city's famed aqueducts supplied immense amounts of water, but mainly to public fountains and private villas. There was no widespread system of hydrants or immediate water access for firefighting. Imagine trying to put out a city-sized blaze with a bucket brigade and hand tools. It was an impossible task. In the aftermath, Nero faced public fury. To deflect blame, he famously and notoriously scapegoated the burgeoning Christian community, initiating brutal persecutions. But the fire also forced change. Nero, for all his flaws, seized the opportunity to rebuild Rome. The new city that rose from the ashes of 64 CE was different. Wider streets replaced the narrow alleys. Building regulations were enforced, requiring better materials and more fire-resistant construction like stone and concrete. The infamous insuli were subject to height limits, and new public spaces and porticos offered refuge and fire breaks. While the rebuilding was often oppressive, involving forced labor and high taxes, Rome did emerge safer, if not happier. The lessons of that inferno were etched into the very foundations of the reborn city. But Rome wasn't alone. Across the empire, and indeed, across the ancient world, every city faced the same terrifying vulnerability. Whether it was Alexandria, Antioch, or a smaller provincial town, dense populations and the ubiquitous use of open flames made urban centers inherently fragile. Every fire, no matter how small, carried the potential for total annihilation. The Great Fire of Rome was not an anomaly. It was the most dramatic and devastating example of a constant, lurking threat. It underscored a brutal truth. Before modern technology, a major urban fire wasn't just a disaster. It was often an act of total, unpreventable erasure, a reset button for society, leaving behind only ash, memory, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding. And yet, fire wasn't the only force that could tear cities apart. And while the Romans wrestled with infernos born of stone cities and political machinations, their successors in Europe faced a far more volatile foe, the very fabric of their lives. Because when the mighty Roman Empire finally began to crumble, the world that rose in its ashes was, for all its spiritual fervor and feudal loyalties, a flammable nightmare. Imagine you've just made it through the chaos of ancient Rome. You're thinking, okay, I survived the sewage and the gladiators. Maybe things get a little calmer now. Oh, my sweet, naive friend, welcome to the Middle Ages, where life might have been less outwardly violent than a chariot race, but it was perpetually on the verge of spontaneous combustion. You see, after the Romans, Europe largely forgot how to build with stone on a grand scale. Timber was abundant, cheap, and easy to work with. So, from tiny peasant hovels to bustling market towns, the medieval world was built predominantly of wood. Walls, roofs, floors, even entire sections of castles were constructed from this highly combustible material. And that's just the beginning. Your average medieval home? A cozy single-room affair, often with a thatched roof. That's right, layers of dried straw or reeds. Lovely for insulation, absolutely catastrophic when a single spark decided to drop by. Picture every house in every village, huddled together, often sharing walls, or separated only by a narrow, garbage-strewn alleyway. Streets weren't wide thoroughfares for chariots anymore. They were often winding, congested passages, barely wide enough for a single cart, and certainly not for a quick escape route when a fire started roaring. And fires were everywhere, not just from accidents. Think about daily life. Open hearths for cooking and heating, often right in the middle of the room, sending sparks skyward. Candles for light, usually just flickering tallow dips. Blacksmiths hammering red-hot iron next to thatched roofs. Bakers stoking wood-fired ovens. Plus, you got piles of straw, hay, animal dung, and general refuse often stacked right outside homes or in cluttered courtyards. It was a ticking time bomb just waiting for a misplaced ember or a moment of carelessness. When a fire started in this wooden world, it didn't just spread, it exploded. The dry wood, the tinder-like thatch, the narrow, air-sucking streets acting as natural flues. It was a perfect storm of destruction. A small cooking fire could turn into a city-devouring inferno in minutes. Imagine the scene. One moment, the familiar hum of village life. The next, a scream, the crackle of wood, and then the roar. Flames leaping from rooftop to rooftop, feeding on the dry timber, racing through the densely packed homes. Smoke, thick and acrid, chokes the narrow passages, making escape a nightmare. And firefighting? Forget modern hydrants, fire trucks, or even organized brigades. Your medieval response was a chaotic symphony of desperate shouts and futile gestures. People would grab buckets, often leather or wood, and sprint to the nearest well or river. They'd form human chains, passing water hand to hand, a valiant but often hopeless effort against a blaze consuming entire city blocks in minutes. The water would evaporate on contact with the roaring inferno, or simply be too little, too late. Sometimes, the desperation turned to destructive logic. Villagers or town officials would frantically try to pull down neighboring houses with ropes and hooks, creating a fire break. But imagine trying to demolish a burning building with basic tools, while smoke blinds you and embers rain down. It was dangerous, often ineffective, and frequently led to further panic and injury. The consequences were biblical. Entire towns could vanish overnight. Think of the London Fire of 1133, which consumed a huge swathe of the city, or the various other medieval blazes that swept through the wooden heart of the capital before the infamous Great Fire of 1666. Paris, too, suffered countless devastating fires throughout the Middle Ages, often sparked by accidental blazes in its crowded artisan quarters or even royal palaces. Churches, once symbols of permanence and divine protection, would become towering infernos, their wooden roofs collapsing amidst a shower of burning timber, leaving behind only charred stone walls and melted bells. The loss was immeasurable. Homes, businesses, precious goods, vital food stores, and irreplaceable religious artifacts. But more tragically, lives. People trapped in the narrow streets, suffocated by smoke, or crushed by collapsing structures. The elderly, the very young, anyone slow or disoriented, often had no chance. The psychological impact was profound. For a deeply religious society, such widespread destruction was often seen as divine punishment, a sign of God's wrath or the devil's work. Fear and superstition fueled the despair, further hindering any rational response. Rebuilding was a monumental task, often taking years, leaving thousands homeless and destitute, relying on the mercy of their lords or the charity of distant monasteries. The economic fabric of a town could be shattered for generations. Despite this recurring devastation, true innovation in fire prevention was slow to arrive. Laws were sometimes passed, mandates for stone construction in certain areas, requirements for fire buckets, or rules against open fires at night. But enforcement was spotty, and tradition, cost, and convenience often won out over safety. Most people simply resigned themselves to the terrifying reality. Fire was an inevitable, brutal force that could descend at any moment, turning their wooden worlds into endless loss. Their only hope was frantic, disorganized action, a prayer, and a desperate scramble to escape the roaring maw of an unstoppable medieval firestorm. And yet, these infernos, destructive as they were only one of the many raging forces that shaped the medieval world. But as humanity pushed beyond the confines of castle walls and crowded market towns, seeking new lives on vast, untamed frontiers, the nature of fire changed entirely. No longer was it merely a local menace, contained, or at least containable, by stone and water. Now it was a force of cosmic scale, sweeping across entire landscapes, swallowing forests, prairies, and the fledgling settlements carved into them. We're talking about wildfires so immense, so utterly overwhelming, they made the urban infernos of old look like a mere campfire spark. Imagine, for a moment, the sprawling, seemingly endless wilderness of North America in the 18th and 19th centuries. A land largely unmapped, untamed, brimming with fuel, generations of trees, centuries of dry undergrowth, prairies stretching for thousands of miles, all just waiting for a spark. Native American tribes for millennia had a complex and often beneficial relationship with fire, using controlled burns to manage hunting grounds, clear land, and promote new growth. They understood fire's power, and, crucially, they understood its rhythm. But then came the European settlers. They saw not a balanced ecosystem, but a resource. They cleared vast tracts of timber, leaving behind mountains of highly combustible slash, branches, stumps, sawdust, pile high like tinder for a colossal barbecue. They built their homes from wood, their fences from wood. Their entire towns were often just collections of kindling scattered across a wild, dry landscape. And they brought new practices, careless campfires, sparks from trains, uncontrolled agricultural burns that spiraled out of control faster than a runaway horse. It was a recipe for catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. And the catastrophes came. Take the Miramichi Fire of 1825, a name whispered in hushed tones even today in the forests of New Brunswick, Canada, and Maine, USA. Conditions had been bone dry for months. Rivers were low, forests parched. Then, on October 7th, a small, likely accidental, fire near the Miramichi River in New Brunswick exploded. Fueled by relentless winds and vast tracts of logging debris, it wasn't just a fire, it was a firestorm. It moved with the speed of a galloping horse, an estimated 1.5 to 3 million acres. That's roughly the size of Connecticut or almost half of Belgium. Consumed in mere hours. Entire towns like Newcastle and Douglastown were not just burned, they were vaporized. Accounts speak of the sky turning a terrifying, unnatural red. The air filled with ash and embers so thick it was impossible to see, breathe, or think. Rivers became boiling cauldrons, not sanctuaries. People jumped into them only to be cooked alive. The heat was so intense, it created its own weather system, a roaring vortex of superheated air that sucked oxygen from the lungs and literally melted glass. The death toll? Officially, it was around 160. But that was almost certainly a vast underestimate. The frontier was sparsely populated, records were scarce, and many victims simply disappeared, consumed completely by the inferno. Entire families, trappers, loggers, indigenous communities, all vanished. Those who survived were often left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, staring at a landscape transformed into a smoking, desolate wasteland. The Miramichi Fire wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a terrifying demonstration of untamed nature's power, amplified by human impact. It showed how rapidly the seemingly endless bounty of the frontier could turn into a raging, unstoppable hell. But as horrific as Miramichi was, it had a lesser-known, yet even deadlier, cousin just decades later. The year is 1871, October 8th, the same day the Great Peshtigo Fire began its infamous rampage. Another fire, miles away and almost entirely overlooked by history, was preparing to unleash its true fury. This was the Peshtigo Fire in Wisconsin, and it was arguably the deadliest wildfire in recorded history. Unlike Chicago, which was an urban fire, Peshtigo was a wildland fire, roaring through prime logging country. The conditions were identical to Miramichi, a summer of extreme drought, followed by a parched autumn. But what intensified Peshtigo was a sheer, unbelievable amount of fuel. The logging industry in Wisconsin was booming, and with it came vast, untouched forests converted into a sea of timber slash, sawdust, and waste. It was a fuse running for miles, when a small fire, likely from a spark from a locomotive or a settler's clearing fire, ignited near the town of Peshtigo. It didn't just burn, it exploded. What followed was a literal firestorm, a phenomenon so rare and terrifying it defies imagination. The fire consumed so much oxygen and generated such extreme heat that it created its own powerful tornado-like winds, pulling air inward with unimaginable force. Trees weren't just burning. They were exploding into flame, twisted and ripped from the ground by the sheer rotational power of the inferno. The roar was deafening, a monstrous symphony of destruction that could be heard for miles. People described seeing walls of fire, miles high, moving at incredible speeds, devouring everything in its path. The town of Peshtigo and surrounding communities were obliterated, not burned down but annihilated. Buildings made entirely of wood and filled with highly flammable sawdust from the lumber mills simply vanished. People trapped in cellars or wells were suffocated by the superheated, oxygen-depleted air or literally incinerated. Some, fleeing to the Peshtigo River, found it boiling, turning into another death trap. The fire was so fast, so complete, that many victims were found essentially mummified, preserved in the instant of death by the extreme heat, a chilling testament to the speed and intensity of the blaze. The exact death toll of the Peshtigo Fire remains a grim mystery, estimated between 1,500 and 2,500 lives. It's hard to be precise because entire families, entire small towns, simply ceased to exist, leaving no one behind to count or record their loss. The fact that it happened on the same day as Chicago and was so utterly overshadowed by the urban tragedy highlights a fundamental truth about frontier fury. These fires were so massive, so far-reaching, and so utterly destructive that their true impact often went unrecorded, lost in the vastness of the wilderness they consumed. And Peshtigo wasn't an isolated incident. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were punctuated by similar infernos across North America. The Great Hinckley Fire of 1894, the Yakult Burn of 1902, the Great Idaho Fire of 1910. All were fueled by unchecked logging practices, prolonged drought, and powerful winds, turning what seemed like endless resources into endless conflagrations. These fires showcase a raw, untamed power that human communities, with their nascent infrastructure and limited firefighting capabilities, simply could not withstand. The frontier, with all its promise, was also a furnace, and humanity was often caught right in the blazing, unforgiving heart of it. When nature truly unleashed its fury, it was a terrifying, humbling spectacle. But what happens when we set the stage for destruction? When our relentless march of progress, our glittering cities, and our booming industries create a new kind of tinderbox? Welcome to the industrial age, where flames weren't always born in the wild, but in the heart of human ambition, turning entire cities into roaring infernos. The 19th century exploded with growth. Cities swelled faster than anyone could build them, piling people into crowded tenements and hastily constructed wooden buildings. Mile after mile, crammed with timber, shared walls, and narrow alleys barely wider than a wheelbarrow. No fire breaks, no real planning. You were building an urban tinderbox, weren't you? And then, into this kindling-packed maze, you introduced the very engines of the Industrial Revolution. Factories, towering brick structures humming with machinery, belching smoke, churning out everything from textiles to tools. Step inside and you saw not just innovation, but danger. Furnaces roaring with coal, boilers threatening to explode. Massive amounts of highly combustible materials, cotton bales, oil barrels, chemical vats, stacked ceiling high, often next to open flames or friction-generating machines. Safety regulations, a polite fiction in the pursuit of profit. Gas lighting, early jury-rigged electrical systems, the constant production of explosive dust, new ways to ignite more fuel, packed tighter than ever. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. And it did spectacularly. History is littered with the charred remains of cities that learned this lesson the hard way. The Great Peshtigo Fire of 1871. Forget Mrs. O'Leary's cow. The truth is far more damning for human hubris. Chicago was a city built to burn. The fastest growing city in America, constructed almost entirely from wood. Wooden buildings, wooden sidewalks, even wooden streets in some places. Fire codes were weak, rarely enforced. The fire department relied on horse-drawn steam engines and limited water pressure. On October 8th, a dry, hot summer, and a howling southwesterly wind turned any spark into an inferno. Alarms were delayed, misdirected. Once it took hold, it was unstoppable. Flames leaped across streets, devoured entire blocks in minutes. The sheer heat created fire whirls, spitting embers. The waterworks were quickly engulfed, leaving firefighters helpless. 3 days later, over 2,000 acres were destroyed, 100,000 people homeless, and 300 lives lost. An urban conflagration, a man-made wildfire consuming a city built on kindling. Chicago wasn't an isolated incident. Just a year later, in 1872, Boston faced its own inferno. Again, a densely packed city. Again, wooden buildings, narrow streets. The fire started in a warehouse, overflowing with combustibles. The city's fire chief was away, and the initial response was tragically slow. Worse, it was Sunday, and getting the horse-drawn engines ready from livery stables was a chaotic nightmare, giving the flames precious minutes to gain an unstoppable foothold. Over 65 acres were destroyed, 700 buildings turned to ash. These weren't just accidental blazes. They were systemic failures, exacerbated by the very growth and industry that defined the era. Industrial practices also created new fire risks in smaller communities. Think the lumber industry. Vast forests cut, leaving colossal amounts of bone-dry logging slash, branches, sawdust, bark, waiting for a spark. The Peshtigo Fire, on the very same day as Chicago's, is a horrifying example. It ravaged northeastern Wisconsin, devouring over 1 million acres and wiping out the town of Peshtigo, killing an estimated 1,200 to 2,500 people. These industrial towns, literally built from the wood they harvested, were consumed when the inferno came, engulfing homes, factories, and the forests that fueled their economy. Fires fueled by human activity, by the insatiable appetite of the industrial age. So, why were these infernos so unstoppable? A perfect storm of vulnerability. Cities of wood, packed cheek by jowl, inadequate water supplies, primitive fire departments, slow communication, and highly flammable materials, cotton, oil, coal, chemicals, designed to burn hot and fast. Once a fire breached a building, especially a factory, it became a raging beast, creating its own winds and spreading sparks far ahead. A domino effect of destruction, a man-made firestorm that defied control. These weren't just unfortunate accidents. They were a brutal wake-up call. The great fires of the industrial age forced cities to rethink everything. Building codes, urban planning, fire safety. They led to a slow, painful shift from wood to brick, stone, and eventually steel. They spurred professional, organized fire departments, improved water infrastructure, and better fire suppression technologies. These infernos, born of ambition and carelessness, became catalysts for change. But the lessons were often written in ash, paid for with lives, and learned only after the smoke had cleared and the terrible silence had fallen over what was once a thriving city. The fires of the industrial age reshaped our landscapes, not just in the wild, but in the very heart of our civilization. You thought those city-eating infernos of the industrial age were the peak of human-made fire disasters, didn't you? You thought once we'd slapped down regulations, build a few fire departments, and maybe stop packing entire factories with dry sawdust and oily rags, that we had fire tamed. That was just a warm-up act. Because what came next, what we live with now, isn't just a bigger fire. It's a completely different beast, unleashed by something far more insidious than a stray spark or an overloaded circuit. It's a beast born of our own touch on the planet. The modern megafire, And trust me, it's not just burning the old world. It's remaking the new one charred landscape at a time. Imagine the Chicago fire, but it's not contained to a city. It's eating entire states. Imagine the London fire, but it doesn't stop at the Thames. It leaps across continents. You think those blazes of the past were unstoppable? We had no idea. Because the fires of today, these true megafires, are fueled by a relentless, invisible hand. Climate change. The planet, pushed past its limits, is creating perfect tinderboxes. Droughts are longer, deeper, sucking every drop of moisture from forests, grasslands, and even the soil itself. Trees, once green and resilient, become brittle sticks, primed to explode. Heat waves, once an occasional summer nuisance, now bake landscapes for weeks, turning entire ecosystems into crispy, combustible fuel. Then comes the wind. Oh, the wind! That cruel, unpredictable breath that whips embers into infernos, carrying sparks for miles, turning a tiny blaze into a raging firestorm in minutes. It's not just a bad day for a barbecue. It's an apocalyptic force, turning entire communities into ash before you've even finished packing your bags. And we, in our infinite wisdom, have built right into the heart of these tinder boxes. We've chased a dream of a quiet life surrounded by nature, pushing homes further and further into the wild and urban interface. That dangerous zone where human development meets wild, combustible vegetation. Your dream home nestled amongst the pines. Your sprawling suburban development backing onto a seemingly serene forest. It's beautiful, idyllic even, until that unholy trinity of heat, drought, and wind unleashes a blaze. Then, those charming natural landscapes become an express lane for destruction. Houses, built with flammable materials, packed with possessions, become their own fuel source, exploding like individual bombs, creating their own firestorm that leaps from rooftop to rooftop, turning entire neighborhoods into incinerators. It's not just forests burning anymore. It's entire communities, swallowed whole in a matter of hours. These aren't just wildfires anymore. The term feels almost quaint, a gentle flick of the wrist for what we're actually facing. These are fire-breathing monsters, behaving in ways that defy our understanding and overwhelm our best efforts. They create their own weather systems, pyrocumulonimbus clouds, towering, smoke-filled thunderheads that generate lightning, sparking new fires miles away. They spawn fire tornadoes, swirling vortices of flame and superheated gases that rip through landscapes with unimaginable force, tossing trees like matchsticks and turning everything in their path to cinder. The heat is so intense, it often reduces entire towns to dust and ash, leaving behind only the faintest outlines of what once was. Concrete foundations, twisted metal, a lone ceramic bathtub. The grim monuments of lives erased in a flash. Look to the headlines. The names echo like grim warnings. Paradise, California. A town vanished in hours, reduced to a ghost of itself. Lahaina, Hawaii. A historic coastal town, devoured by flames so fast, residents barely had time to flee into the ocean. Australia's Black Summer, where nearly 46 million acres burned, blanketing cities in smoke, decimating wildlife, and pushing entire species to the brink. Canada, once seen as a bastion of pristine wilderness, now choked by megafires that send smoke plumes drifting across the entire North American continent, painting skies orange over New York and fouling the air over Europe. And the Mediterranean, with its sun-drenched coasts and ancient olive groves, now routinely ablaze, turning tourist havens into scorched earth. This isn't a regional problem. It's a planetary fever, and we're all breathing the smoke. The consequences stretch far beyond the immediate burn scar. The air you breathe, no matter how far from the flames, is filled with microscopic particulate matter, impacting respiratory health, exacerbating existing conditions and creating new ones. The economic toll is staggering. Billions lost in property, infrastructure, tourism, and agriculture. Entire industries are devastated. And the psychological scars, the trauma of loss and displacement, linger for generations. Communities, built over decades or centuries, are wiped clean, their history turned to ash, their social fabric shredded. It's not just homes that are lost. It's identity, memory, a sense of belonging. The very concept of a natural disaster begins to feel insufficient when human fingerprints are all over the fuse box. Our firefighting capabilities, once world-leading, are increasingly overwhelmed. Brave men and women, equipped with cutting-edge technology and decades of experience, find themselves battling blazes that laugh at fire breaks, leap across rivers, and rage through the night with relentless fury. It's like bringing a garden hose to fight a dragon, then watching the dragon grow 2 more heads. Resources are stretched thin, both human and mechanical. The sheer scale demands international cooperation, a stark reminder that fire, when fueled by climate, respects no borders. We stand at a terrifying threshold. The fires of the past, even in their destructive glory, were largely episodic, constrained by technology, population density, and predictable seasons. The mega-fires of today are new normal, a terrifying consequence of our collective footprint, changing not just landscapes but the very air we breathe. They are a stark, undeniable testament to the raw, destructive power of nature, amplified by humanity's touch. But fire, even fire as monstrous as this, is just one of Earth's raging forces, unleashed and amplified by our interference. Because while we've been busy battling these infernos, other cataclysms, equally devastating and just as human-influenced, have been stirring beneath the surface, waiting for their moment to break free. But if you think fire is the only element bent on reshaping our world with violent hand, well, Earth has other plans, other rages, other, even more ancient, ways of reminding us who truly holds the power. For every megafire that devours a forest or city, there's a deeper, more primal fury simmering beneath the surface, churning in the depth of the ocean, or roaring in the unforgiving skies. Consider, for a moment, the volcano, not just a mountain, but a living, breathing, subterranean beast with a heart of molten rock and a breath of ash and fire. Imagine Vesuvius, on that quiet August morning in 79 CE, standing sentinel over the bustling Roman towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum. One moment, life hummed with the rhythm of commerce, gossip, and daily ritual. The next, the sky ripped open. What happened wasn't a fire you could fight with buckets. It was an eruption of such apocalyptic scale that it swallowed entire cities whole. First, a choking rain of ash and pumice, burying homes, suffocating citizens where they stood, preserving their final, terrifying moments in a gray, silent tableau. Then, the pyroclastic flows, superheated clouds of gas and volcanic debris, racing down the mountain at hundreds of miles per hour, incinerating everything in their path. There was no escape, no negotiation, just the earth asserting its undeniable, terrifying will. And it wasn't just Pompeii. In 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia unleashed an eruption so colossal it plunged the entire planet into the infamous year without a summer. Crops failed, famine spread, and societies buckled under the weight of a sunless, ash-choked sky, all because one mountain decided to clear its throat. These aren't mere natural disasters. They are geological heart attacks, explosions of primal energy that reshape landscapes and rattle human civilization to its very core. But the Earth's rage isn't always thrown from the sky. Sometimes, it grinds from beneath our very feet. The earthquake, that terrifying shudder, the groan of the planet, as the solid ground we take for granted suddenly becomes a liquid, churning nightmare. Imagine Lisbon on All Saints' Day, 1755. A city of churches, palaces, and bustling docks, filled with people in prayer. Then, without warning, the world tore itself apart. Buildings swayed, cracked, and then simply imploded, crushing thousands in seconds. The very foundations of human order, philosophical and physical, turned to rubble. But the earthquake, as devastating as it was only the prelude. The ground settled, the dust began to clear, and then the true horror emerged from the sea. What came next was a direct, chilling reminder that the Earth's forces are often interconnected, a symphony of destruction with multiple, terrible movements. Because after the ground stops shaking, sometimes the ocean decides it's its turn. The tsunami, a silent, insidious killer, born from the violent displacement of the seabed, perhaps by an earthquake or a colossal underwater landslide. You don't hear it coming like a storm. You don't see it like a fire. It simply appears, a wall of water rising from nowhere, turning into an unstoppable force that can erase entire coastlines. Think of Lisbon, again, that same day in 1755. After the tremor subsided, the sea receded, exposing the seabed, luring curious survivors onto the shore. Then, the three colossal waves rolled in, swallowing the city and its desperate inhabitants whole, completing the work the earthquake began. Or consider the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa, a volcanic explosion so immense it generated tsunamis that devoured villages on distant islands, drowning tens of thousands, a terrifying testament to how far the ocean can carry a mountain's fury. And then there was the Indian Ocean in 2004, where a magnitude 9.1 earthquake off the coast of Sumatra unleashed a series of waves that raced across thousands of miles of open water, striking without warning, claiming over 250,000 lives across 14 countries, washing away everything in their path, leaving behind only debris and a horrifying silence. The sea, usually a source of life and commerce, becomes an indifferent, all-consuming monster, a cold, wet hammer smashing human aspirations. And finally, sometimes the very air turns against us, whipping into monstrous storms and unleashing deluges that drown entire regions. Hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, nature's grandest, most furious displays of atmospheric power. Picture Galveston, Texas, in 1900, a thriving port city, largely unprepared for what was coming. The Great Storm, hit with winds over 140 miles per hour, followed by a colossal storm surge that swallowed the island city whole, drowning between 8,000 and 12,000 people in a single night. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history, a grim lesson in humanity's vulnerability to the untamed skies. Or consider the ancient floods of China's Yellow River, often called China's Sorrow. Not just a river, but capricious, vengeful deity that regularly overflowed its banks, burying entire provinces under water and silt, sometimes claiming millions of lives in a single event, reshaping history with catastrophic watery hands. These aren't just weather patterns. They are atmospheric annihilations, reminders that even the air we breathe can turn into a weapon, amplified by a warming planet that churns hotter, angrier oceans. From a fire that devours the ground that splits, the ocean that swallows, and the skies that unleash watery fury. Earth has always reminded us of its raw, untamed power. While we build cities, forge empires, and push the boundaries of technology, these ancient, raging forces remain indifferent, waiting. They are the planet's enduring heartbeat, a constant, visceral testament to human fragility and the unyielding might of a world that still, truly, belongs to itself. If the Earth has its temper tantrums, with its quakes, floods, and raging infernos, we humans, well, we've learned to throw a few of our own. And sometimes our temper tantrums, powered by ambition, hubris, and a dash of pure, unadulterated engineering folly, make nature's fury look like a polite tea party. We've seen the sheer destructive beauty of wildfires. But what happens when the blaze isn't kindled by lightning or drought, but by the volatile ingenuity of mankind itself? From the moment we figure out how to harness fire, we also started playing with forces beyond our immediate control. And nowhere is that more evident than in the spectacular, often terrifying, history of man-made cataclysms. The explosions that vaporize cities and the engineered disasters that crumble dreams. It began subtly enough, with the discovery of black powder, gunpowder. Suddenly, humanity had a tool that could propel projectiles, demolish fortifications, and when mishandled, turn a perfectly good workshop into a very loud, very sudden cloud of splinters and sorrow. Early accidental explosions were often localized, maybe taking out a handful of alchemists or a particularly unlucky cannon foundry. But as our ambition grew, so did the scale of our self-inflicted wounds. We built bigger powder magazines, packed more volatile chemicals, and constructed machines designed to control immense forces. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The Industrial Revolution, that grand age of steam and steel, brought with it a new class of disaster. Humanity built bigger, faster, hotter, and when those ambitious creations failed, they failed spectacularly. Boilers exploded in factories, turning colossal engines into shrapnel storms. Mines, dug deep into the earth for coal, became death traps from gas explosions, suffocating entire communities in minutes. Early chemical plants, experimenting with volatile compounds, sometimes just disappeared leaving craters where buildings once stood, and a lingering smell that wasn't quite right. Imagine the sheer, unbridled chaos of the Halifax explosion in 1917. A French cargo ship, loaded with high explosives bound for the battlefields of World War I, collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbor. The resulting blast wasn't just an accident. It was an event that redefined what an explosion could do. Windows shattered 100 miles away. The city of Halifax was virtually leveled. 2,000 people died instantly. Thousands more were injured, and a tsunami surged across the harbor. It was, for a time, the largest man-made explosion in history before the dawn of the nuclear age, a chilling testament to humanity's capacity to unleash absolute devastation, even by mistake. And then there was the Texas City disaster in 1947, another grim reminder that sometimes the most catastrophic forces come from the seemingly benign. A freighter carrying ammonium nitrate, a common fertilizer and explosive component, caught fire in port. The inferno was so intense, the blast so immense, it triggered a chain reaction. The explosion caused another ship, also carrying ammonium nitrate, to detonate, then blew up nearby oil storage tanks. Nearly 600 people died, 1,000 buildings were destroyed, and the city was rocked to its core. It was a Hell's Cape born not from malice, but from a fatal cocktail of carelessness and combustible chemistry. But man-made cataclysms aren't just about explosions. They're about engineered failures. The moment we began shaping the world with dams, bridges, and colossal buildings, we introduced a new vulnerability. We put immense trust in our calculations, our materials, our ability to control nature, and sometimes nature, or a simple human error, reminded us of our hubris. Take, for example, dam failures. We build these towering walls of concrete and earth to tame rivers, to store water, to generate power. They are symbols of human mastery. But when they breach, the consequences are biblical. The Johnstown flood of 1889, though not an explosion, was a cataclysmic engineered disaster. An inadequately maintained dam upstream collapsed after heavy rains, unleashing a wall of water, debris, and human misery that annihilated the town in minutes, killing over 2,200 people. It was a monument to human ingenuity gone tragically wrong, a reminder that even structures meant to save can, through neglect, destroy, or consider bridge collapses. These elegant spans meant to connect can become instruments of death. From the Tay Bridge disaster in 1879, where a train plunged into icy waters due to poor design in a storm, to the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, nicknamed Galloping Gertie, in 1940, whose graceful oscillations famously turned into a catastrophic twist due to aerodynamic flutter. These were structures meant to defy gravity, but succumb to human miscalculation or the subtle forces of nature. They highlight how the grandest designs can be undone by the smallest flaws, leading to rapid, terrifying ruin. And then, of course, they're the ultimate engineered disaster: nuclear power. When we split the atom, we unlocked a force capable of powering cities or obliterating them. Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima in 2011 weren't accidental collisions or misplaced chemicals. They were complex, meticulously engineered systems that, through human error, design flaws, or natural catastrophe, spiraled out of control. These weren't mere explosions. They were systemic failures. With the very brilliance of the engineer became the source of an invisible, long-lasting terror, poisoning land and lives for generations. The lessons from these man-made cataclysms are grim, but vital. They're a testament to our relentless ambition, our desire to build bigger, faster, more powerful. But they also expose our fallibility, our shortcuts, our moment of hubris, and the simple fact that when we try to play God, the consequences can be truly hellish. The debris wasn't just metal and stone. It was shattered lives, broken trust, and the uneasy realization that sometimes the biggest monsters aren't in the wild, but in our blueprints, our ambition, and our desperate need for control. And these disasters, whether explosive or implosive, don't just leave physical scars. They leave deep, festering wounds on societies that built them. Sometimes the most devastating fires aren't physical at all, but beyond the explosive force of engineered disasters and the raw power of nature's fury, there's another kind of cataclysm entirely, a different kind of fire, one that burns not with flame and heat, but with righteous anger, simmering resentment, and the terrifyingly rapid combustion of social order itself. We're talking, of course, about societal conflagrations, the fires of revolution and collapse. Think about it. A society, a civilization, it's a complex, delicate ecosystem. It's built on trust, on shared rules, on a million tiny unspoken agreements. But what happens when that trust erodes? When the rules feel unjust? When the agreements shatter like brittle glass? Sometimes, the entire structure goes up in a metaphorical smoke, consumed by forces more potent and unpredictable than any wildfire. Human desperation, ideological zeal, and the sudden, terrifying realization that the old world has nothing left to offer. Let's start with perhaps the most iconic of these societal infernos, the French Revolution. For centuries, France had operated under a system that was, well, let's call it traditional. You had the clergy, the nobility, and then everyone else. And everyone else meant 98% of the population burdened by taxes, suffering from famine and utterly excluded from power, while the elite lived in opulent excess. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, charming though they may have been in courtly portraits, seemed utterly oblivious to the simmering rage outside the palace walls. It was like living in a gilded palace built atop a volcano that was loudly rumbling, demanding attention. Then came the catalysts. Enlightenment ideas, whispering of liberty, equality, and the rights of man, spread like sparks through dry tinder. Famine, bread shortages, and crippling national debt, exacerbated by France's support of the American Revolution, irony much, ignited the lower classes. You couldn't eat liberty or pay your rent with enlightenment, but those ideas certainly made the injustice of it all burn hotter. On July 14th, 1789, the Bastille, a medieval fortress and symbol of royal tyranny, was stormed by an angry Parisian mob. It wasn't just a prison break. It was a societal explosion. The fire had begun. What followed was a brutal, chaotic, and utterly transformative blaze. The monarchy was overthrown, the nobility stripped of its power, and the old order systematically dismantled. But this wasn't a gentle, controlled burn. Oh no, this was a conflagration that consumed its own children. The Reign of Terror, led by Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, devoured thousands. Nobles, priests, even fellow revolutionaries who weren't radical enough, all met the guillotine. It was a vicious cycle. The fire of revolution, fueled by paranoia, consuming itself. The French Revolution reminds us that when societal foundations are built on extreme inequality, the inevitable fire can be devastatingly indiscriminate, leaving behind not just ruins, but a profound and often bloody legacy of fear and transformation. But not all societal conflagrations are sudden, explosive revolutions. Some are slower, creeping burns, decades, even centuries of internal decay, external pressure, and gradual erosion, until a mighty structure and empire simply collapses under its own weight. Look at the slow, drawn-out decline and fall of the Roman Empire. This wasn't a single event, no dramatic storming of the gates that instantly brought down the Colossus. This was a chronic, festering burn. By the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century CE, Rome, the eternal city, was wrestling with a laundry list of existential crises. Economic instability, hyperinflation, declining trade, and a currency so debased it was practically worthless. Soldiers, the very backbone of the empire, were underpaid, disgruntled, and often more loyal to their generals than to Rome itself. They were like the overtaxed firefighters of an increasingly dilapidated house, tired and under-equipped. Political instability was another slow-burning fuse. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying frequency, often murdered by their own guards or rivals. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome saw over 20 legitimate emperors, most dying violent deaths. Imagine trying to run a sprawling empire when your leader changes more often than the seasons. It's impossible to implement long-term policy when your lifespan is measured in months, not years. Then came the external pressures. Barbarian tribes, Goths, Vandals, Huns, weren't just random raiders. They were sophisticated, often displaced peoples, driven by their own needs, testing the increasingly porous borders of the empire. They were like thousands of tiny, persistent sparks, constantly probing the weaknesses of a structure that was already rotting from within. Rome's overstretched legions, depleted by internal civil wars and endless border skirmishes, simply couldn't hold a line anymore. And perhaps most insidious of all, the moral and social fabric of Rome seemed to fray. Apathy, corruption, declining civic duty, and a widening gap between the fabulously wealthy elite and the struggling masses. It was like a dry rot, slowly weakening the very timbers of the Roman house. By the time the final metaphorical flames engulfed Rome in 476 CE, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed, the empire had already been burning for centuries. The fire wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable end of a long, slow conflagration. So what does this tell us? That societal collapse isn't always about a dramatic, singular explosion. Sometimes it's a creeping decay, a gradual loss of integrity that leaves the mighty vulnerable to even a gentle push. Let's shift gears to a more recent, but equally transformative, fire. The Russian Revolution of 1917. For centuries, Russia had been ruled by the Romanov dynasty, a vast, autocratic empire clinging to medieval notions of divine right, while much of Europe modernized. Peasants lived in abject poverty. Industrial workers labored in harsh conditions, and political dissent was brutally suppressed by the Tsarist regime, often with secret police and Siberian exile. It was a pressure cooker, simmering for generations. The triggers were multiple and interconnected. Decades of social and economic inequality. The sheer brutality of serfdom, only abolished in 1861, far later than Western Europe, and a series of humiliating military defeats. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 2005, a shocking loss for a supposedly great power, exposed the Tsar's incompetence. World War I, however, proved to be the final massive spark. Millions of Russian soldiers were slaughtered on the front lines, while back home, food shortages and economic hardship intensified. Tsar Nicholas II, a man utterly ill-suited to lead in a crisis, seemed to embody the regime's fatal blindness. In February 1917, the fire ignited. Strikes, protests, and riots erupted in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. Soldiers, many of them peasants forced into uniform, refused to fire on the crowds. The Tsarist regime, with centuries of absolute power, simply crumbled. It wasn't a single organized coup. It was a spontaneous societal breakdown. The Tsar abdicated, and a provisional government took over. But the fire wasn't out. The provisional government, attempting to bring democratic reforms while still prosecuting the disastrous war, failed to address the deep-seated grievances of the people. This left a void, and into that void stepped the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Their message was simple, direct, and intoxicating: peace, land, and bread. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in a relatively bloodless coup. But this merely escalated the conflagration into a brutal civil war that lasted for years, consuming millions of lives in its ideological flames. The White Army anti-Bolsheviks fought the Red Army Bolsheviks with horrifying ferocity, often with foreign intervention. Famine, disease, and political purges added to the death toll. The Russian Revolution wasn't just a change in leadership. It was a total societal reset, a complete burning of the old order and the forced, violent birth of a new, radically different system. It reminds us that sometimes the fire of revolution is not just about overthrowing the old, but about installing a new, often unyielding, and sometimes even more destructive force in its place. These societal conflagrations, whether sudden, explosive revolutions or slow, creeping declines, teach us profound and often uncomfortable lessons. They remind us that human societies, for all their strength and ingenuity, are inherently fragile, that inequality, injustice, weak leadership, and blind adherence to outdated systems can, and often do, lead to catastrophic, transformative fires, and that sometimes the aftermath of the burning is even more brutal than the blaze itself, demanding generations to rebuild from the ashes of what once was. Because when the human spirit decides enough is enough, the resulting inferno can reshape the entire world. And sometimes it takes centuries for those flames to truly die down. And sometimes the conflagration isn't born of political fury or human ambition. Sometimes the world is consumed by a fire you can't see, a burn that silences cities not with shouts, but with coughs. We've talked about the dramatic, the roaring blazes of history, from ancient wildfires that reshaped landscapes to the societal infernos of revolution. But what about the other kind of devastation? The one that creeps in on unseen currents, that doesn't arrive with thunderclap, but with a whisper, then a fever, then the terrible silence of too many unburied dead. This is the story of history's silent burn. The plagues, the pandemics, and the unseen devastation that has, time and again, fundamentally reshaped human civilization in ways no army or wildfire ever could. Think about it. A wildfire screams, a revolution explodes. You see the enemy, you feel the heat. A plague? It's a silent assassin, a phantom enemy that slips past your gates, your guards, your grandest fortifications, and gets right into your lungs. It doesn't care if you're king or peasant, rich or poor. It just arrives, often from somewhere far away, carried by the smallest, most unassuming vectors. A sneeze, a flea, a rat scurrying unseen in the shadows. From the dawn of recorded history, humanity has grappled with these invisible enemies. The ancient world, crowded and less hygienic than a pigsty on a hot day, was particularly vulnerable. Imagine a world of pharaohs, the bustling markets of Mesopotamia, the sun-drenched city-states of Greece. Life was tough enough, filled with backbreaking labor, questionable food, and gods who seemed eternally annoyed. Then, something new would appear. Not an invading army, but a sickness that turned people black, that made them cough up their guts, that left children wailing for parents who wouldn't answer, who needed a conquering army when a simple fever could do the job of depopulation more efficiently. Take the plague of Athens in 430 BC. The city, locked in a brutal war with Sparta, was already stressed. Then the sickness arrived. It didn't come with swords, but with symptoms that baffled the greatest minds. Burning eyes, bloody throats, terrible internal heat, skin that erupted in sores. Thucydides, the great historian, himself a survivor, described the horror with chilling precision. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Laws broke down. People, believing they would die anyway, plunged into hedonism or despair. The very fabric of Athenian society, that beacon of democracy and philosophy, began to fray. It wasn't a military defeat that brought Athens to its knees. Not really. It was a cough, a fever, a terrible, silent burn. Moved forward to the Roman Empire, the supposed pinnacle of ancient order and might. Even Rome, with its legions, its aqueducts, its grandiosity, was utterly helpless against the silent invader. The Antonine Plague, which struck around 165 CE, is believed to have killed millions across the empire, perhaps as many as a quarter of the population. Imagine Rome, the beating heart of the known world, suddenly facing widespread death, its legions decimated, its trade routes disrupted, its granaries overflowing because there was no one left to work the fields. It was a blow from which the empire arguably never fully recovered, subtly weakening its foundations, pushing it closer to decline, not with clash of steel, but with a silent, creeping dread that spread from household to household, unnoticed until it was too late. And then, centuries later, the plague of Justinian arrived in the Byzantine Empire around 541 CE. It was a truly biblical catastrophe, believed to be the first major outbreak of bubonic plague. Carried by fleas on rats that hitched rides on trade ships, it swept across the Mediterranean, killing perhaps 25 to 50 million people. That's a quarter to half of Europe's population at the time. Imagine the sheer scale of that loss. Cities emptied, trade halted, the very dead outnumbered the living. There were reports of bodies piled so high in Constantinople that they had to be stacked in towers or loaded onto ships and sent out to sea. It paralyzed the empire, forcing Justinian, one of its greatest emperors, to abandon his grand plans of reconquering the lost Western Roman Empire. The silent burn consumed armies, economies, and imperial ambitions, leaving behind a scarred, depopulated continent that would slowly transform into the medieval world. But no plague in history burned quite so brightly or so horrifyingly as the Black Death. Emerging in the mid-14th century, the second wave of bubonic plague was the ultimate unseen devastation. It started somewhere in Central Asia, perhaps carried by infected marmots, then hitched a ride on Mongol armies, and spread along the Silk Road, reaching Europe via Genoese trading ships in the Black Sea. Legend says the Mongols even catapulted infected corpses over the walls of the besieged city of Kaffa. A medieval form of biological warfare, perhaps, but the real vectors were simpler. The fleas on rats, and then terrifyingly person-to-person transmission. When it hit Europe around 1347, the continent was utterly unprepared. No one understood bacteria, viruses, or germ theory. They blamed God's wrath, planetary alignment, bad air, or even persecuted scapegoats like Jewish communities. The symptoms were gruesome: fever, chills, black boils, buboes, in the armpits and groin, often followed by blackening of extremities as the blood congealed. Death was swift, often within days. Imagine the sheer terror. Doctors wore bizarre bird-like masks, stuffed with herbs, hoping the bad air wouldn't reach them. People sealed themselves in homes or fled, unwittingly carrying disease with them. No one was buying souvenir t-shirts. The death toll was staggering. Estimates vary, but between 75 and 200 million people died worldwide in just a few short years. Europe alone lost an estimated 30 to 60% of its population. Think about that. More than half the people you knew gone. Entire villages were wiped out. Fields lay fallow. The dead were so numerous that mass graves became the norm. There was no time for proper burial, no respectful rituals. The scent of rotting flesh hung heavy in the air of every city. But the devastation didn't end with death. The Black Death fundamentally reshaped medieval society. With so many people gone, labor became incredibly valuable. Feudalism, based on a surplus of peasant labor, began to collapse. Peasants could demand better wages, more freedom. Landlords, desperate for workers, had to concede. It changed economic power dynamics, leading to social unrest, and even peasant revolts in following decades. Religious faith was shaken. If God was good, why did he let this happen? Art became morbid, filled with images of skeletons dancing with the living, the dance macabre. Medicine, utterly helpless, was forced to question its basic assumptions. It was societal conflagration, not a fire and revolution, but despair and loss, leaving behind a world that, though smaller, was also fundamentally different. And the silent burn continued for centuries beyond. Smallpox ravaged populations for millennia, especially devastating indigenous communities in the Americas who had no immunity to European diseases. Syphilis, though less lethal, changed social norms and art. Tuberculosis, the White Plague, slowly consumed millions, especially in urban centers. Its devastation less dramatic but equally relentless. Even into the modern era, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920, another unseen killer, proved that even with medical advances, humanity remained vulnerable, claiming more lives in World War I. More recently, HIV/AIDS reshaped global health and social understanding, quietly burning through communities for decades. The silent burn of plagues and pandemics doesn't dominate our history books with the same dramatic flair as wars or grand construction projects. You don't see monuments to a cough or statues celebrating a fever. Yet, their impact is arguably more profound. They strip away illusions of control, expose societal vulnerabilities, and force humanity to confront its own fragility. They reshape economies, break social structures, and leave a psychological scar that lasts for generations, often laying the groundwork for other types of fires, be they social collapse, revolutionary change, or a quiet, desperate reinvention. They're the unseen forces that push us to remember, with chilling clarity, how truly interconnected and vulnerable we all are, always. But here's the thing about devastation, about the quiet burn that sweeps through our world, whether the forest turned to ash, a city razed by fire, or a population decimated by an unseen enemy. It's rarely the final act. When the smoke clears, when the fever breaks, when the dust settles, there's a silence, profound, aching quiet. But that silence, history shows us, is almost always pregnant with possibility. It's the pause before the next breath, the blank page before a new story is written. Think of it. The Great Fire of London in 1666. For terrifying days and nights, a medieval metropolis, built largely of timber and dreams, became a monstrous inferno. Homes, churches, Guildhall, St. Paul's Cathedral, gone. Over 13,000 houses, a staggering 87 parish churches, reduced to a smoldering, unrecognizable wasteland. The sheer scale of the destruction was, well, biblical. London, a vibrant hub of trade and power, was suddenly a vast, smoking ruin. It was a city utterly devastated, wiped clean in a furious blaze. But did London stay buried in ash and sorrow? Absolutely not. What rose from those ashes was a city reborn, not just rebuilt, but reinvented. This wasn't just about putting bricks back where it once stood. The Great Fire provided a brutal, undeniable lesson. Wood-framed houses packed tight along winding medieval lanes with death traps. So, the rebuilding effort, led by figures like Christopher Wren, wasn't just about replacement. It was about reimagining. London rebuilt itself with wider streets, made largely of stone and brick, with stricter building codes aimed at preventing such a conflagration from ever happening again. The very tragedy forced a modernization, a leap forward in urban planning and safety that might have taken centuries otherwise. It was a phoenix, yes, but one that came back with fireproof wings. And what about those unseen blazes? The silent burns of plagues and pandemics we just discussed. The Black Death, for instance, between 1346 and 1351. It ripped through Europe, wiping out an estimated 30% to 50% of the population. Imagine half the people you know, gone. Entire villages depopulated. Social structures strained to breaking point. Feudalism, that ancient system tying peasants to the land, seemed utterly secure. But a biological firestorm of that magnitude doesn't just kill people. It reinvents society. With labor so scarce, survivors found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. Peasants could demand higher wages, better conditions, and greater freedoms. The old feudal order began to crumble, not under the weight of revolution, but under the quiet, relentless pressure of empty fields and too few hands. Wages rose, social mobility increased, and the seeds of a new economic and social landscape were sown, born directly from the ruins of a cataclysm. It was a dark, terrible crucible, but from emerged, however painfully, a pathway to new opportunities and a more fluid society. Then there are the disasters that shake the very ground beneath our feet, forcing not just physical rebuilding, but profound reinvention of thought. Take the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. On All Saints' Day, November 1st, a massive earthquake, followed by tsunamis and raging fires, utterly obliterated Lisbon, the prosperous capital of Portugal. Tens of thousands died. Churches, palaces, public buildings, gone. It was a catastrophe so profound that it shook not just buildings, but philosophical certainties across Europe. Why would God allow such destruction on a holy day? This wasn't just a physical disaster. It was an intellectual one. But from the rubble of Lisbon emerged a new way of understanding the world. Instead of simply blaming divine wrath, thinkers like the Marquis of Pombal, Portugal's prime minister, famously asked, "What do we do to bury the dead and feed the living?" This wasn't a philosophical question. It was a practical one. He ordered an immediate scientific study of the earthquake's effects, pioneering modern seismology. Lisbon was rebuilt with strict architectural plans, laying the groundwork for modern urban planning and disaster-resistant construction. The disaster, in essence, gave birth to a new science and a new approach to building, based on empirical observation rather than just faith. From the ruins came radical reinvention, a shift from spiritual fatalism to scientific inquiry and human agency. And this pattern repeats itself, again and again, through history's darkest chapters. Think of the monumental rebuilding of Europe after the literal and moral wasteland of World War II. Cities flattened, industries shattered, millions dead. It was the largest concentrated destruction of human infrastructure in history. But from that devastation came not only physical reconstruction on an unprecedented scale, but profound reinvention of international relations. The very idea of a United Nations, of a global body designed to prevent future conflicts, was born from the ruins of that war. The initial seeds of what would become the European Union, a radical concept of economic and political integration to ensure peace, were sown in the ashes of conflict. It was a painful, agonizing rebirth, but one driven by an undeniable collective will to prevent recurrence, to build a future fundamentally different from the past. The common thread through all these stories, from the ashes of ancient cities to the silent devastation of plagues, is a stubborn, almost miraculous human trait: resilience. We rebuild. We adapt. We learn, often slowly, often painfully, from the very forces that threaten to erase us. We invent new ways of living, new materials, new social contracts. The scars remain, yes, etched into the landscape and collective memory, but they become catalysts for change. They remind us of vulnerability, but also of capacity. They tell us that while destruction can sweep away what was, also clears the ground for what can be. It's the ultimate testament to human ingenuity and our unyielding will to endure. The fires burn, the floods rage, the earth trembles, the silent diseases spread. But when the dust settles and the last echo fades, you'll find us there, sifting through the wreckage, sketching new plans and ready to begin again. Not because we forget the cost, but because we refuse to let the past dictate the future. We rise from ruins every single time, not just rebuilding, but reinventing ourselves stronger, wiser, and endlessly, stubbornly determined to not just survive, but to thrive. The story of destruction, in the end, is always a story of defiant rebirth. We've journeyed to the infernos that raised ancient cities, the conflagrations that defined empires, and the relentless march of modern megafires. We've seen nature's raw, untamed power and humanity's often fragile attempts to stand against it, then to rise again. But after the smoke clears, after the last ember dies, and after the dust settles into new foundations, what truly remains? What is the enduring legacy of destruction? It's not just the ashes, the scars on the land, or the ghost town silhouettes where vibrant communities once stood. No, the legacy of destruction is etched far deeper than that. It's in our collective memory, in the lessons we desperately try to learn, and in the unspoken promises we make to ourselves and to future generations. For every firestorm, every societal collapse, every engineered disaster, history holds up a scorched mirror, daring us to look. Think of ancient cities, so often vulnerable, so often reduced to rubble. Did they simply rebuild brick by brick? Sometimes, but more often, they rebuilt differently. The Great Fire Rome, for all its terrifying fury, forced Nero's hand, leading to new building codes, wider streets, and an urban redesign. When Chicago burned in 1871, it didn't just rebuild, it reinvented itself, rising as a steel and glass titan, a monument to a new kind of urban resilience. The old wooden city, a tinderbox, gave way to something seemingly impregnable. The fire, horrific as it was, became a brutal, unforgiving architect. And it's not just cities. Wildfires for millennia have scorched landscapes, yet they also trigger ecological renewal, cleansing undergrowth, returning nutrients, and prompting the germination of dormant seeds. It's a harsh, violent cycle. But today, these fires are supercharged, apocalyptic beasts fueled by a changing climate, gnawing at coastlines and devouring towns with unprecedented speed. And that, my friends, brings us to a new, terrifying layer of legacy. When destruction scales up, the lessons multiply. The climate crisis, a slow-motion conflagration, isn't just about rising temperatures. It's about systemic vulnerability. Our hubris in thinking we can control nature has created the perfect kindling for a global inferno. The legacy here isn't just about building higher or wider. It's about rethinking everything. Our energy sources, urban planning, resource management, and frankly, our very definition of progress. But destruction isn't always marked by flame and ash. Remember the silent burn, the plagues and pandemics that swept through societies, leaving not physical ruins, but demographic craters. The Black Death, for all its horror, irrevocably altered European society, leading to labor shortages, shifting power dynamics, and even laying groundwork for the Renaissance. Such widespread devastation forces a brutal stress test on human systems and beliefs. Our recent global pandemic, too, forced a rapid rebuilding of scientific consensus and the frantic reinvention of work and education. The enduring legacy is still being written in changes to our societal contracts and our understanding of communal risk. Then there are the engineered disasters, man-made cataclysms where human ambition or negligence collides with explosive force. Chernobyl, Fukushima, permanent scars on the Earth, radioactive monuments to the double-edged sword of technological advancement. The legacy here is a chilling reminder of unintended consequences, of the invisible enemies we can unleash, and the long, slow, silent burn that can continue for generations. We learn that some wounds never truly heal. They just become part of the landscape, demanding constant vigilance and a somber respect for forces we barely understand. And finally, the societal conflagrations, the fires of revolution and collapse. When empires crumble, when old orders are violently overthrown, it leaves behind a wreckage of political systems, social norms, and collective identities. The French Revolution, the fall of Rome, these weren't just regime changes. They were seismic events that reshaped continents and consciousness. The legacy isn't simply new flags or leaders. It's a deep-seated trauma, a collective memory of the fragility of power, the volatility of crowds, and the often bloody birth of new ideas. But it's also about reinvention. The phoenix rising from the ashes, sometimes stronger, sometimes just different, but always carrying the genetic memory of the burn. So, what are the enduring lessons for an uncertain future? First, vulnerability is inherent. We can build higher, stronger, smarter, but absolute invincibility is a myth. This isn't pessimism, it's pragmatism. Second, destruction is often a catalyst. It forces adaptation. It compels innovation. It exposes weaknesses. It can be a brutal teacher, pushing societies beyond comfortable complacency. Third, interconnectedness is both our strength and our Achilles heel. A wildfire in one region can impact global air quality. A pandemic in one country can shut down the world. Our solutions, therefore, must be as interconnected as our problems. No longer can we afford to build silos, physical or ideological. Fourth, memory matters. The stories of devastation, the scars on the land, the collective trauma. These are not just history. They are data, warnings, guides. Forgetting the lessons of past destruction is not just negligent. It's an open invitation for history to repeat its cruelest rhymes. We must listen to the whispers of ancient fires, the echoes of fallen walls, and the silent cries of forgotten plagues. Fifth, agency is everything. While we can't control every external force, we can control our response. We can choose to rebuild sustainably. We can choose to learn from our mistakes. We can choose to prioritize resilience over immediate comfort. We can choose collective action over individual gain. The future is not pre-written in smoke. It's being forged in our present choices. The greatest legacy of destruction is not the ruin itself, but the forced evolution it imposes. It's the stark reminder that every ending is also a beginning, often a painful, necessary one. The question isn't whether the next fire will come. The question is, when it does, what kind of world will we have built to face it? What lessons will we have truly absorbed? And what will our enduring legacy be when the smoke clears?